Hello everyone, and welcome back to today's History Official. Today, we're stepping into a fascinating time capsule, September 15th, a date that has witnessed battles, revolutions, groundbreaking political decisions, and even the birth of literary legends. What makes days like this so extraordinary is not just the events themselves, but the way they ripple forward, shaping the world we live in today. Now, let me ask you this. When you think about history, do you imagine a dusty old book full of dates and names? Or do you imagine real people facing impossible choices, fighting wars, writing books, or declaring independence? Because that's what today's story is really about, the human side of history. Picture this, back in the year 994, on the banks of the Orontes River, the mighty Byzantine Empire faced the Fatimids in a battle that would test the strength of nations. Imagine the clash of swords, the cries of soldiers, and the uncertainty of an empire wondering if it would stand or fall. That moment didn't just decide the outcome of a battle, it shifted the balance of power across the Middle East, and believe it or not, that was just the beginning of what this single date had in store. Fast forward to 1795. The world is changing. European empires are fighting, not only on land, but also for control of the seas. The British seized the Cape Colony from the Batavian Republic, an event that doesn't just redraw a map, but changes the course of South African history forever. Why? Because the Cape wasn't just a colony, it was the gateway between Europe and Asia, a lifeline for global trade. And then, of course, we come to 1812. Napoleon, the man who dreamed of ruling all of Europe, enters Moscow. Think about it. The city of Moscow, a symbol of Russian pride, standing in flames as Napoleon's soldiers marched through deserted streets. It should have been his greatest victory, but instead it became the beginning of his downfall. One date, one decision, and history took a different turn. But September 15th is not just about battles and empires, it's also about independence and freedom. In 1821, Guatemala declared independence from Spain. This wasn't just a local event. It was part of a wave of revolutions that would transform Central America. On this day, people said enough to centuries of colonial rule, and their voices still echo in the celebrations that continue every September 15th. And let's not forget the cultural impact of this day. On September 15th, 1890, a child was born in Devon, England, Agatha Christie. She would grow up to become the Queen of Crime, creating stories and characters like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, who still captivate readers and viewers today. Her works have sold over 2 billion copies worldwide, second only to Shakespeare and the Bible. Imagine that one person's imagination shaping the minds of millions across the globe. And that's just scratching the surface. September 15th also witnessed the birth of modern warfare with the first use of tanks, the tragedy of the Nuremberg Laws, and the rebirth of Germany after World War II. It saw Algeria's first president rise to power, signaling the end of colonial rule in Africa. So when we look at this single date, September 15th, we see a day that connects empires, revolutions, inventions, and culture. A day that reminds us that history isn't random, it's alive, it's connected, and it shapes everything around us. Over the next few minutes, we'll dive deeper into each of these incredible stories. You'll feel the intensity of battle, the determination of independence, the genius of great minds, and the struggle for justice. And before we begin, if you love history, if you love uncovering the hidden connections between past and present, then don't forget to like this video, subscribe to today's History Official, and hit that notification bell so you never miss our weekly deep dives into the moments that changed our world. So grab your seat, open your mind, and let's step together into the past. Because September 15th is not just another date. It's a reminder that every single day in history has a story worth telling. Let's travel back more than 1,000 years to the year 994, where the mighty Byzantine Empire and the powerful Fatimid Caliphate stood at odds, and their armies clashed on the banks of the Orontes River. The Byzantine Empire, once a shadow of ancient Rome's glory, was still a formidable power in the eastern Mediterranean. Its capital, Constantinople, gleamed with wealth, art, and strategic importance. But empires are not measured by walls and palaces alone, they are measured by their ability to protect and expand their influence. And in the 10th century, Byzantium's influence was constantly challenged by rising Islamic states. Among them, the Fatimid Caliphate, which controlled vast territories stretching from North Africa to parts of the Middle East. The Orontes River, winding through modern-day Syria, was more than just a river. It was a lifeline for trade, agriculture, and military movement. Whoever controlled the river valleys held a strategic advantage in the region, and it was here, on this vital ground, that the destinies of two great powers collided. The Fatimids, determined to expand their dominance, launched a campaign against Byzantine holdings in Syria. Their forces were skilled, disciplined, and motivated by both political ambition and religious fervor. The Byzantines, meanwhile, were defending their long-standing frontier zones, territories that had been contested for centuries, changing hands between empires as though history itself was playing tug-of-war. Now, imagine the scene: banners waving, the dust of marching feet rising, the sound of horns echoing across the valley. The Byzantine forces, proud and experienced, believed they could push back the Fatimid advance. But on that fateful day in 994, the Fatimids outmaneuvered them. The battle was brutal. Swords clashed, arrows darkened the skies, and the cries of soldiers filled the air. Step by step, the Byzantines began to falter under the sheer force of the Fatimid assault. Their formations broke, their morale collapsed, and what began as a confident defense turned into a devastating defeat. This was not just a battlefield loss. It was a humiliation for the Byzantine Empire, an empire that saw itself as the rightful heir to Rome, yet had been beaten decisively in open combat. News of the defeat spread quickly, shaking confidence in Byzantine strength and emboldening their enemies. The outcome of the Battle of Orontes shifted the balance of power in the region. The Fatimids gained momentum, their prestige rising as Byzantium scrambled to recover. For the Byzantine rulers, this battle was a wake-up call. It exposed weaknesses in their military and forced them to rethink their strategies in the Middle East. But here's what makes this story fascinating. The Orontes battle was not the end of Byzantine ambitions. It was a setback, yes, but also a lesson. Over time, the Byzantines adapted, restructured their armies, and continued to fight for dominance in these contested regions. In history, defeats often teach more than victories, and the fall of Byzantium was still centuries away. So, why does this battle matter to us today? Because it illustrates a timeless truth. Empires rise and fall not just on grand victories, but on unexpected defeats. One river, one battlefield, one moment in 994 was enough to tilt the power struggle in the Middle East and remind both sides that no empire, no matter how glorious, is invincible. The Battle of Orontes stands as a reminder that history is shaped as much by failure as by success. And for the Byzantines, this painful defeat was etched into their story, a warning that would echo in the centuries to come. Let's sail back to the late 18th century. The year is 1795, and the world is in turmoil. Europe is on fire with revolutions and wars. Old empires are collapsing, new nations are rising, and across the globe, colonies are caught in the storm of change. One such place was the Cape Colony, located at the very tip of southern Africa. Now, the Cape wasn't just any colony. It was a jewel of geography, a stopover point on the long sea route between Europe and Asia. For centuries, sailors rounding the Cape of Good Hope relied on its harbors, its fresh water, and its position as the gateway between the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans. Whoever controlled the Cape controlled the trade routes to the east, and in the age of sails and empires, that meant power. At the time, the Cape Colony was under the control of the Batavian Republic, the new Dutch state that had emerged after French revolutionary forces occupied the Netherlands. The Dutch East India Company, once dominant and feared across the oceans, was now in decline. Its finances were ruined, its influence was fading, and its colonies were vulnerable. The British, on the other hand, were watching closely. The French Revolution had thrown Europe into chaos, and Britain was determined not to let France or its allies gain control of key territories. The Cape, strategically placed on the maritime lifeline to India, was too valuable to risk falling into French hands. So, in 1795, the British launched an expedition. Their fleet sailed south, around Africa, and anchored near the Cape. With them came soldiers, sailors, and the clear intent to seize the colony. The local Dutch garrison and settlers, known as the Boers, were not eager to give up control. They resisted, but their defenses were weak compared to Britain's naval might. The confrontation came to a head at the Battle of Nuremberg. British forces landed, their cannons roaring as they advanced. The Dutch defenders, outnumbered and under-equipped, fought bravely but were gradually pushed back. The hills echoed with musket fire, smoke filled the air, and slowly, the British tightened their grip. By the end of 1795, the Cape Colony was firmly in British hands. The Union Jack was raised, marking a dramatic shift in control over one of the world's most important sea routes. But here's the twist. This was not yet a permanent conquest. For a time, the Cape would pass back and forth between Dutch and British control as European politics shifted. Yet the invasion of 1795 marked the beginning of a much longer story because eventually, the British would hold the Cape permanently, reshaping the region's history, politics, and society for centuries to come. This event also had consequences far beyond Africa. It showed how global the wars of the 18th century had become. What began as a revolution in France rippled outward to influence colonies thousands of miles away. It was proof that the Age of Empires was not just about Europe, it was about every ocean, every trade route, every colony that could tip the balance of power. For Britain, the capture of the Cape was a strategic triumph. It secured their route to India, the crown jewel of their empire, and gave them a naval stronghold that would endure well into the 20th century. For the Dutch settlers, however, it marked the beginning of centuries of tension, displacement, and transformation under British rule. So, when we think of September 15, 1795, we're not just talking about a colonial skirmish, we're talking about a turning point in global trade, imperial rivalry, and the fate of southern Africa itself. The Union Jack flying over Cape Town wasn't just a flag, it was a symbol of how power at sea could shape the destiny of nations on land. The year is 1812. Europe trembles under the shadow of one man, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, master strategist, and perhaps the most feared military commander of his time. For over a decade, he has reshaped the continent, toppling kingdoms, rewriting borders, and building an empire that stretches from Spain to Poland. But in the summer of 1812, Napoleon sets his sights on his most ambitious target yet, Russia. His goal, to force Tsar Alexander I back into the continental system. The economic blockade meant to cripple Britain, Napoleon's sworn enemy. If Russia refuses, Napoleon is prepared to bring them to their knees. And so, in June of 1812, the Grande Armée, one of the largest armies ever assembled in European history, marches east. Nearly 600,000 soldiers from across Europe cross the Niemen River. French, Italians, Poles, Germans, Dutch, an army not of one nation, but of an empire. At first, Napoleon expects a quick campaign, a decisive battle, and then peace on his terms. But the Russians have a different strategy. Instead of meeting Napoleon head-on, they retreat deeper and deeper into their vast homeland, burning villages and supplies as they go. This is the infamous scorched earth policy. Napoleon's army finds only ashes where they expected food and shelter. The heat of the summer, the endless marches, and the lack of supplies begin to wear down even this mighty force. Still, Napoleon presses forward, determined to bring Russia to the table. By September, he approaches the gates of Moscow, the symbolic heart of the Russian nation. On September 14, 1812, Napoleon enters the city. But instead of a triumphant victory, he finds silence. Moscow is eerily empty. Most of the population has fled, carrying away what they could. The streets echo with the sound of boots and hooves, but no cheers greet the emperor. Then, disaster strikes. Fires break out across the city, whether set by Russian patriots, retreating soldiers, or the wind carrying sparks. Soon Moscow is engulfed in flames. Wooden houses collapse in roaring infernos, churches blaze against the night sky, and Napoleon's prize turns to ashes before his eyes. For 5 weeks, Napoleon waits in the ruins of Moscow, expecting Tsar Alexander to sue for peace. But no envoy ever comes. Instead, the Russian winter begins to close in. The once invincible Grande Armée is trapped far from home, short on supplies, and with no clear plan of escape. The entry into Moscow, once hailed as a triumph, becomes the beginning of Napoleon's downfall. The retreat that follows is one of the most catastrophic in military history. Of the 600,000 men who marched into Russia, barely 100,000 make it back. Hunger, cold, disease, and relentless Russian attacks turn victory into tragedy. The sight of Napoleon in Moscow, standing in a burning, deserted city, has become one of the most haunting images of his career. It is a reminder that even the greatest generals can overreach, that ambition can outpace strategy, and that nature itself vast distances. Bitter winters and scorched earth can defeat even the mightiest armies. So, when we remember September 14th, 1812, we see not just Napoleon's entry into Moscow, but the turning of the tide. It marks the moment when his empire reached its greatest height, only to begin crumbling. Within just 3 years, Napoleon would be defeated, exiled, and stripped of the power he once wielded over Europe. The burning of Moscow stands as a lesson in history. Sometimes, what looks like victory is really the beginning of defeat. The year is 1821, and Central America is standing at the edge of history. For 3 centuries, these lands have been under the rule of the Spanish Empire. Cities like Guatemala City, Antigua, and Leon flourished as colonial centers. But beneath the surface, tension was growing. The people of the region, indigenous communities, mestizos, and even Creole elites began to feel the winds of change sweeping across the world. The age of revolutions had already shaken the globe. The American Revolution in 1776, the French Revolution in 1789, and the waves of independence movements across South America led by leaders like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín inspired Central America to consider its own destiny. Spain itself was weakened, caught in political turmoil after Napoleon's invasion of the Iberian Peninsula. The empire was no longer the unshakable giant it once was. In Guatemala, whispers of independence grew louder. The Creole elites, those of Spanish descent born in the Americas, wanted more autonomy, more control over trade, and freedom from Spain's restrictive policies. At the same time, the broader population longed for relief from colonial taxes, forced labor, and the inequality of the caste system. The breaking point came in September 1821. By then, Mexico had already declared its independence earlier that same year, creating a ripple effect throughout the region. Leaders in Guatemala feared unrest and uprisings if they didn't act quickly. On September 15th, 1821, in the city of Guatemala, representatives from across the region gathered and signed the Act of Independence of Central America. It was a bold declaration. Guatemala, along with present-day Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica, would no longer be colonies of Spain. Instead, they would chart their own future. The signing was celebrated with church bells, public ceremonies, and a cautious hope that freedom had finally arrived. But independence was not a simple solution, it was the beginning of a new struggle. Should these nations unite as a single federation, or go their separate ways? In the years that followed, the region experimented with the Federal Republic of Central America. But divisions, local rivalries, and political instability eventually led each country to pursue its own path. Still, the events of September 15th remain a turning point. In Guatemala, it meant the end of 3 centuries of colonial rule. It marked the beginning of a national identity, even if the road ahead was uncertain. And today, this date, September 15th, is celebrated across Central America as Independence Day. Think about it. One decision in a meeting hall in Guatemala City reshaped not just one nation, but an entire region. The echoes of that moment are still felt today, in the flags, the festivals, and the pride of millions of Central Americans who look back on 1821 as the year their nations were born. So, when we talk about September 15th, 1821, we're not just remembering a document or a ceremony. We're remembering a dream of freedom, a dream that continues to inspire generations across Guatemala and beyond. The year is 1916. Europe is in the middle of the First World War, a conflict unlike anything humanity had ever seen. Millions of men are dug into endless trenches stretching across France and Belgium. Machine guns, barbed wire, and heavy artillery make any attempt to cross no man's land almost certain death. The war has ground to a bloody stalemate. Both sides search desperately for a way to break it. On September 15, 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, something extraordinary rolled onto the battlefield, something that would forever change the face of warfare: the tank. These machines, codenamed landships by the British, were designed to do what infantry could not: cross trenches, crush barbed wire, and withstand enemy fire while advancing across the battlefield. Officially, they were called Mark I tanks, but to the soldiers, they looked like massive, lumbering iron beasts. The British Army had been secretly developing these machines for years. The idea was revolutionary: an armored vehicle powered by a heavy engine moving on continuous caterpillar tracks instead of wheels, designed to move across the mud and devastation of the Western Front. Up until then, battles were dominated by artillery bombardments, followed by waves of infantry charges tactics that led to unimaginable losses. The tank promised something different: mobility, protection, and shock power. When the tanks first appeared on the morning of September 15th, near the French village of Flers-Courcelette, soldiers on both sides were stunned. Imagine the scene: the gray fog of early dawn, the ground shaking with artillery, and then suddenly, giant armored vehicles crawling slowly out of the smoke, spitting machine gun fire. To the British infantry, it was a moment of awe and hope. To the German defenders, it must have seemed like a nightmare come to life. But these early tanks were far from perfect. They were slow, noisy, and prone to breaking down. Out of 49 tanks deployed that day, less than half actually made it into combat. Some overheated, others got stuck in the mud, and a few broke down before even reaching the battlefield. Yet, even with these flaws, the psychological impact was massive. German troops were terrified. Reports say some abandoned their positions at the mere sight of the armored monsters. The initial success at Flers was limited. The tanks couldn't move fast enough to exploit breakthroughs, and they suffered heavy mechanical failures. The Somme continued to be a slaughterhouse, with little territorial gain compared to the horrific casualties. But the potential was clear. Commanders and engineers knew that with improvements, tanks could change everything. And they did. In the years that followed, tanks became faster, stronger, and more reliable. By 1918, in the last year of the war, tanks played a decisive role in breaking German lines and bringing the conflict to an end. What began as an experimental gamble on September 15, 1916, evolved into a weapon that defined modern warfare throughout the 20th century. Think about it. Before that day, battles had been fought with men, horses, and artillery. After that day, the tank was born, and the battlefield would never be the same. From the deserts of North Africa in World War II to conflicts around the globe in the 21st century, the tank's legacy can be traced back to that muddy battlefield on the Somme. So when we remember September 15, 1916, we remember the dawn of a new era of warfare. It was the day when machines replaced horses, when armor replaced flesh, and when innovation gave soldiers a new, terrifying, and powerful tool. The Somme may not have delivered victory in 1916, but it delivered something else: a vision of the future of war. The year is 1935. Germany is under the firm grip of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Since rising to power in 1933, Hitler has been reshaping German society according to his ideology of racial purity, nationalism, and authoritarian control. Step by step, the regime had stripped away freedoms, censored the press, dissolved opposing political parties, and filled the airwaves with propaganda. But on September 15, 1935, the Nazi regime took a radical and chilling step: the passing of the Nuremberg Laws. These laws weren't just another set of political decrees. They were designed to redefine what it meant to be a citizen of Germany and, more dangerously, who was excluded from that definition. At the heart of the Nuremberg Laws was one central target: the Jewish people. Let's break this down. The first law was the Reich Citizenship Law. Under this law, German Jews were stripped of their citizenship. They were no longer considered citizens of the Reich, but merely subjects. This meant they had no political rights. They couldn't vote, couldn't hold public office, and were essentially made outsiders in their own country. The second was the law for the protection of German blood and German honor. This law forbade marriages and even sexual relations between Jews and so-called Aryans. It criminalized love, family, and human connection across the lines the Nazis had drawn. To them, it was about protecting the purity of the German race. But it didn't stop there. These laws also restricted Jews from flying the German flag, from employing German servants, and from participating fully in German cultural life. Overnight, millions of German Jews woke up as foreigners in the land their families had called home for centuries. And what made these laws even more disturbing was their pseudoscientific foundation. The Nazis categorized people by bloodlines. If you had 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents, you were classified as a Jew, regardless of your faith or cultural identity. Even people who had converted to Christianity decades earlier were suddenly labeled outsiders. The Nuremberg Laws were not just about Jews either. They laid the groundwork for excluding other groups the Nazis deemed undesirable, including Roma, people of African descent, and later, many with disabilities. So why Nuremberg? The laws were announced during the Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg, one of the most theatrical displays of Hitler's power. Tens of thousands of Nazi supporters filled massive stadiums, waving flags, marching in unison, and listening to fiery speeches. The setting emphasized that these laws weren't just bureaucratic changes, they were part of a grand vision of a racially pure Germany. The impact was immediate and devastating. Families were torn apart, businesses ruined, careers destroyed. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, artists, suddenly, Jewish professionals could no longer serve the public. Children were taught in schools that Jews were inferior. Propaganda posters portrayed them as dangerous, corrupting forces. Society itself was being reshaped to normalize discrimination. And here's the chilling reality. The Nuremberg Laws were just the beginning. They laid the legal foundation for the horrors that would follow: the ghettos, the deportations, and ultimately, the Holocaust. By legally dehumanizing Jews, the Nazis prepared the population to accept, or at least tolerate, what would come next. Looking back, the Nuremberg Laws stand as one of history's darkest reminders of how laws can be used not to protect, but to persecute. They show us that injustice often begins not with violence, but with words written on paper. Laws passed in parliaments, cheered on by crowds, and justified by twisted ideologies. September 15, 1935, was more than just a date in history. It was a turning point where hate was codified into law, and a society began its descent into genocide. Remembering this day forces us to confront the power of laws, the danger of prejudice, and the importance of defending human rights before it's too late. The year is 1949. Europe is still reeling from the devastation of the Second World War. Cities lay in ruins, economies are shattered, and millions of people are displaced. Germany, once at the heart of Nazi power, is now a divided nation, split into 4 occupation zones controlled by the Allies, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Out of this division, 2 Germanys are beginning to emerge. In the West, under Allied influence, the groundwork is being laid for a democratic state. In the East, under Soviet control, a communist government is forming. And on September 15, 1949, history is made when Konrad Adenauer is elected as the first Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. But who was Adenauer, and why was his election such a turning point? Konrad Adenauer was no ordinary politician. Born in 1876, he had lived through the German Empire, the First World War, the Weimar Republic, and the rise and fall of Hitler's Third Reich. He had seen his country rise, collapse, and suffer catastrophic defeat. And now, at the age of 73, he stepped into leadership at one of the most fragile moments in German history. Adenauer represented the Christian Democratic Union (CDU), a party committed to rebuilding Germany on the principles of democracy, stability, and integration with the West. When he was chosen as chancellor by just a 1-vote majority, many thought he would be a temporary figure. After all, he was already elderly, and Germany's problems seemed overwhelming. But Adenauer proved them all wrong. His leadership would shape not only Germany, but the entire post-war order of Europe. First, Adenauer understood that Germany could not rebuild in isolation. He forged strong alliances with Western powers, particularly France, Britain, and the United States. At a time when many Germans still viewed the Allies with resentment, Adenauer argued that cooperation, not defiance, was the only path forward. This vision led to West Germany joining key organizations like the European Coal and Steel Community, the foundation of what would later become the European Union. Second, Adenauer pushed for economic recovery. Partnering with his Minister of Economics, Ludwig Erhard Adenauer, oversaw the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle. Through market reforms, foreign aid from the Marshall Plan, and disciplined governance, West Germany transformed from a bombed-out nation into one of the world's leading economies within just a decade. Third, Adenauer had to confront the Cold War reality. With the Berlin blockade in 1948-49 and rising tensions between East and West, the division of Germany was hardening. Adenauer accepted this reality and focused on making West Germany a stable, secure, and respected state. In 1955, under his leadership, West Germany even joined NATO, cementing its place in the Western Alliance. But Adenauer's leadership was not without controversy. He faced criticism for being too willing to reconcile with the West at the expense of German unity. Some accused him of neglecting relations with the East and abandoning hopes for reunification. Yet Adenauer believed that only a strong democratic West Germany could eventually provide the foundation for reunification in the future. In hindsight, Adenauer's vision proved crucial. By guiding West Germany into the Western democratic community, he set the stage for the eventual reunification of Germany in 1990. His tenure as Chancellor lasted until 1963, making him one of the longest-serving leaders in German history. So, when we remember September 15, 1949, we remember not just the election of a new Chancellor, but the rebirth of a nation. Konrad Adenauer stood at the crossroads of history, turning Germany away from dictatorship and devastation toward democracy, prosperity, and integration with the world. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter that showed how even in the darkest aftermath of war, leadership, vision, and determination could rebuild a nation and restore its place in the world. September 15, 1963, on this day, a new chapter began in the history of North Africa. Ahmed Ben Bella was declared the first president of independent Algeria, marking a turning point not just for his country, but for the entire African continent. But who was Ahmed Ben Bella? And why did his rise to power matter so much, both in Algeria and around the world? Let's take a closer look. Born in 1916 in the small town of Magnia, Ben Bella grew up during the height of French colonial rule. Like many Algerians, he experienced the deep inequalities of colonial life, land controlled by settlers, limited rights for the native population, and a government that treated Algerians as second-class citizens in their own homeland. Ben Bella's early years were shaped by both struggle and resilience. During World War II, he actually fought with the French army against the Axis powers and even received medals for bravery. But the irony was clear: while he fought for France abroad, his own people were denied freedom at home. This realization fueled his desire for change. After the war, Algeria's independence movement gained momentum, and Ben Bella became one of its most determined leaders. As part of the National Liberation Front, known as the FLN, he organized resistance, coordinated guerrilla tactics, and pushed forward the dream of a free Algeria. This wasn't an easy fight. The Algerian War of Independence, from 1954 to 1962, was brutal, marked by violence, repression, and heavy loss of life. Over 1 million Algerians are believed to have died in the struggle against colonial rule. Yet, against all odds, the FLN and the Algerian people prevailed. In 1962, France finally recognized Algeria's independence, and just 1 year later, Ahmed Ben Bella, the freedom fighter, was elected as the nation's very first president. Now, think about that moment for a second. After 132 years of French control, Algeria was finally free, and its first leader was someone who had fought tirelessly for that freedom. For many, Ben Bella symbolized hope, resilience, and the beginning of a new African identity. His leadership wasn't just about Algeria, it echoed across the continent. In the 1960s, dozens of African nations were breaking free from colonial rule, and Ben Bella stood as a symbol of what was possible. But his presidency was not without challenges. Algeria faced the massive task of rebuilding a nation devastated by war. There were deep divisions within the FLN, economic struggles, and political rivalries. Ben Bella pushed for socialist policies, land reforms, and alignment with other revolutionary movements worldwide. He also played an important role in the non-aligned movement, seeking a path independent of both the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. However, his leadership style became increasingly authoritarian, and in 1965, only 2 years after becoming president, Ben Bella was overthrown in a coup led by his defense minister, Wari Boumediene. Still, despite his short time in power, his impact was undeniable. Today, Ahmed Ben Bella is remembered as both a hero of Algerian independence and a symbol of Africa's anti-colonial struggle. His rise to power on September 15, 1963, remains a milestone in the global history of freedom movements. History isn't just about dusty books or old names carved into stone, it's the living story of humanity, unfolding one day at a time. And today, September 15th, reminded us of just that. From the clash of empires along the Orontes River, to Britain's bold move at the Cape of Good Hope, from Napoleon's army marching into the heart of Moscow, to Guatemala's proud declaration of independence, and of course, moments that redefined the modern age, like the invention of the tank, the passing of discriminatory laws in Nazi Germany, and the rise of leaders such as Konrad Adenauer and Ahmed Ben Bella. When we look back, it's not just about memorizing events, it's about understanding how each of these moments shaped the world we live in today. The victories, the defeats, the struggles for independence, the discoveries, and even the mistakes, they are all threads in the fabric of our shared history. And by remembering them, we gain the power to learn, to reflect, and to create a better tomorrow. If you enjoyed this journey through time, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps this video reach more history lovers around the world. And don't forget to subscribe to today's History Official so you never miss an episode. We bring you the most important events from every single day, exploring the battles, the revolutions, the leaders, and the voices that still echo in our lives today. I'd also love to hear from you. What event from September 15th surprised you the most? Was it the invention of the tank during World War I? Or perhaps the story of Agatha Christie, born on this very day in 1890? Whose novels still keep us turning the page in suspense? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I always enjoy reading your insights and starting conversations with history fans just like you. And remember, history is not just in the past, it's happening right now, in this very moment. By exploring yesterday, we better understand today, and we prepare for tomorrow. Thank you so much for watching today's History Official. Stay curious, stay inspired, and until next time, keep history alive.